Nobody warned Mara Vesci that the most dangerous thing she would ever do inside the Bianchi estate would not involve a weapon, a secret, or a wrong turn down a dark hallway. It would be 7 words, whispered to the wrong person, at the wrong hour, in the worst possible corner of that marble-floored mansion. 7 words that would unravel 2 years of careful, calculated survival in the span of a single breath. But we will get to that. First, understand who Mara was, because this story only makes sense if you do. She was not reckless, she was not naive, and she was absolutely not the kind of woman who let her feelings make decisions her brain had already voted against. She was sharp in the way that certain people become sharp when life has handed them enough rough edges to learn from observant, composed, and quietly brilliant at reading a room before it had the chance to read her first. 2 years inside the Bianchi estate had only made her sharper. She had learned the rhythms of that house the way a sailor learns the sea, not by studying it, but by surviving it long enough to stop being surprised by it. She knew which hallways carried voices further than they should, which staff members talked too much, and which silences meant trouble was already on its way before anyone had said a word. She was good at her job, and not just the part that involved a cleaning cart and a schedule. She was good at the real job, the unwritten one, which was keeping her head down, her observations private, and her feelings locked somewhere so deep inside herself that even she sometimes forgot they were there. What she could not lock away, what she had tried and failed to smother for longer than she cared to admit, was the hunger. Not hunger for money, not for status, not for any of the things that the practical, sensible part of her brain could justify wanting. It was the other kind. The kind that has no clean explanation and no safe destination. The kind that sits in the ribcage like something half alive, quiet for weeks at a time, and then suddenly, without warning, unbearably loud. She had kept it quiet for 2 years. And then, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday night, in the low amber light of the East Corridor, standing beside Alina with the rest of the house seemingly asleep, her mouth made a decision without consulting her brain at all. She leaned close, and she whispered it. I'd risk everything for one night with him. What happened next lasted only a few seconds. Alina's smile vanished like a light switched off at the wall, her eyes pulling slowly to somewhere just behind Mara's shoulder, with the particular expression of someone watching a car crash in slow motion and knowing there is absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. Mara turned around, and there he was, Victor Bianchi, standing in the doorway with the stillness of a man who had never once in his life needed to fill a silence to own it. Tall, composed, silver at the temples, dark suit at midnight, as though the hour had specifically dressed to impress him and not the other way around. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He was simply watching her with the quiet, unhurried attention of a man who had just learned something worth knowing and had already begun deciding what to do with it. Mara's next breath came a half-second too late. Because buried beneath the embarrassment, beneath the cold spike of survival instinct rattling through her chest, was one devastating and completely involuntary thought. He was even more striking up close than she had spent 2 years pretending not to notice. And now he knew it too. Stay with us because the moment Victor Bianchi decides he is interested in something, that something never quite belongs to itself again. In the corridor of the Bianchi estate, at midnight, Mara Vesci made the most expensive mistake of her carefully managed life. She said out loud what she should have kept buried, and the man she said it about was standing close enough to count every word. Now Victor Bianchi, a man who does not ignore information that interests him, has decided to find out whether she meant it. Nobody came to tell Mara directly. That was the first thing that unsettled her, not the change itself, but the way it arrived, slipped wordlessly into her weekly schedule like a note pushed under a door in the middle of the night. She found it Wednesday morning, printed on the same plain white paper as every other routine update, clipped to the staff board in the East Wing corridor with the same mundane efficiency as a grocery list. Except this was not routine, and every single nerve in Mara's body knew it the moment her eyes landed on it. Her schedule had been reassigned. Effective immediately, her morning shift would begin not in the guest quarters on the second floor, where she had spent the last 2 years building a quiet, predictable routine, but in the private study on the third floor. Mr. Bianch's private study. Mara read it twice, folded the paper with steady hands, and said absolutely nothing to the 2 other staff members standing within earshot. She was good at that. Elena found her 20 minutes later in the supply room, and she did not bother with pleasantries. "You saw the board," Elena said, not as a question. "I saw it," Mara answered, loading her cart with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for moments when she needed her hands to be busy so the rest of her could think. Elena leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms, lowering her voice to the specific register they both used when the walls were potentially paying attention. "Mara, in 2 years, not one cleaner has been assigned to that study while he is in residence." Mara said nothing, because Elena was not telling her anything she hadn't already worked out herself. "He did this," Elena added, and the weight in those 3 words was enough to fill the entire room. Mara straightened her cart, checked her supplies, and looked at Elena with the composed expression she had spent years perfecting. "I know," she said simply, and she walked out. The third floor was a different country. The rest of the Bianchi estate, for all its wealth and severity, had a kind of cold grandeur that Mara had grown accustomed to, rooms that were impressive but impersonal, designed to signal power rather than reveal it. The private study was different. It was a room that had been lived in, not softened exactly, because nothing about Victor Bianchi suggested softness, but inhabited in the truest sense of the word, in the way that a space takes on the personality of the person who occupies it most. Dark shelves lined 2 full walls, stacked with books that looked read rather than decorative, their spines worn at the creases in the way that only happens when someone has actually gone back to them more than once. A wide mahogany desk sat at the center of the room, anchored by a leather chair that faced the door, faced it directly, deliberately, in the way that certain powerful men position themselves, so that they always see who is entering before the person entering has fully committed to the room. Mara noticed all of this in the first 10 seconds. She also noticed Victor. He was already there. Seated at the desk, his jacket off, the sleeves of his dark shirt rolled precisely to the forearm, a document open in front of him that he appeared to be reading with full concentration. He did not look up when she entered. That, somehow, was worse than if he had. Mara set her cart just inside the door, straightened her uniform out of habit more than necessity, and began to work. She started with the far end of the room, the shelves nearest the window, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had served her well for 2 years, her movements measured and unhurried, giving away absolutely nothing. The room was silent, except for the occasional soft turn of a page at the desk. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Mara had worked her way to the bookcase closest to the desk, close enough now that the silence between them had changed its quality. It was no longer the silence of 2 people ignoring each other, but something more deliberate than that, something that required more effort to maintain from both sides. She reached up to dust the upper shelf, and that was when he spoke. "You are thorough." His voice was even, unhurried, carrying the particular texture of a man who chose every word with the same care he applied to everything else. Not a compliment exactly, not an observation exactly, but something that sat precisely between the two and left very little room to respond without revealing something. Mara did not stop moving. "It's the job," she said, in the same even tone she might use to confirm a supply order. Another silence followed, shorter this time. "Is it?" Victor said. And that was all. 2 words arranged less as a question, and more as the quiet indication that he had noted her answer, weighed it, and was not entirely finished thinking about it yet. Mara kept her eyes on the shelf, kept her hands steady, kept her breathing even and unremarkable. But somewhere beneath all of that composure, beneath every carefully maintained layer of professionalism she had walked into this room wearing, the ember she had spent 2 years managing was doing something she could not immediately control. It was burning considerably warmer than it had 24 hours ago. And the most alarming part, the part she would lie awake thinking about later that night, was not that Victor Bianchi was watching her. It was that she could feel exactly when he stopped. Victor had come to that room with a single question in mind, whether Mara had meant what she said. By the time she walked out, he had his answer. Victor rearranged Mara's schedule without explanation, pulling her out of her routine and into his private study, watching her, measuring her, deciding what kind of woman had been living under his roof without his full attention. Mara had performed composure for 3 days under the most demanding audience she had ever encountered. Now Victor is about to find out whether she is merely attracted to him, or whether she is something considerably more valuable than that. The new schedule held through Thursday and Friday. By Saturday morning, the rest of the staff had stopped pretending not to notice, which meant the whispers had already started, which meant Mara had roughly 48 hours before the speculation hardened into something more difficult to manage. She was aware of all of this and chose, for the time being, to do what she did best. She focused on the work. Each morning she arrived at the 3rd floor study at 8 sharp, spent 2 hours moving through the room with the same deliberate efficiency she had brought on Wednesday, and each morning Victor was present at his desk in varying degrees of engagement, some days deep in paperwork, some days on a low, measured phone call in a language she recognized as Italian, but did not speak well enough to fully follow. He did not ignore her, but he did not perform attention either. He simply existed in the same space with the ease of a man who was entirely comfortable letting silence do the work that most people felt compelled to fill with conversation. Mara understood that quality because she shared it. What she could not entirely account for was how unsettling it was to encounter it in him specifically. She had expected coldness, or the particular brand of detached authority that men in his position usually wore like a second suit. What she had not expected was the sense that he was genuinely, carefully paying attention, not to her movements, not to the cleaning, but to something underneath all of that, something she had not consciously put on display, but apparently had not hidden as well as she believed. It made her precise, in a way that was almost exhausting. Every motion considered, every expression neutral, every word, on the rare occasion words were exchanged, stripped of anything that could be picked apart later. She was performing composure for the most observant audience she had ever had. And then came Saturday. She arrived at the study at 8 to find the room empty. That in itself was not unusual. Victor was occasionally absent when she arrived, appearing sometime in the first hour without announcement, the way people move through their own homes when they have forgotten that someone else is in it. Mara began her routine at the window end of the room, working her way inward with the systematic patience that had become almost meditative over the past few days. She was halfway through the shelves, nearest the desk when she saw it. A single document, sitting in the center of the desk with no folder around it, no weight holding it down, positioned with the kind of casual placement that suggested it had simply been left there by accident. Mara did not touch it immediately. She looked at it the way she looked at most things that didn't feel right, steadily, without urgency, giving herself the few seconds needed to think clearly before her hands made any decisions. The document was face up. She could read the top portion without moving closer, and what she read in those first 2 lines was enough to tell her that this was not a grocery invoice or a staffing memo. Names, figures, and a property address she recognized as sitting in the most quietly contested district in the city, the kind of information that had no business sitting, unattended on a desk in a house where 7 different people had access to this floor. Maris set down her cloth. She picked up the document carefully, holding it by the edge the way you handle something you have decided to return rather than keep, and she turned it face down without reading any further. Then she walked to the door of the study and looked into the corridor. One of the senior housemen, Dario, was passing at the far end with a tray, and she noted his direction and speed the way she noted everything, quickly and without making it obvious. She went back inside, closed the door, and stood at the desk for a moment with the document still in her hand. She had two options, and she knew it. The first was to leave it exactly as she had found it, face up, pretend she had seen nothing, and add it to the long, growing list of things inside this house that she had successfully trained herself not to think about after hours. The second was the one her instincts were already pushing her toward before she had finished forming the thought. She opened the top left drawer of the desk, the only one she had ever seen Victor open with any regularity, placed the document inside face down, and closed it with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything else. Then she picked up her cloth and went back to the shelves. She was there for another 40 minutes before Victor returned. He came in without a word, shrugged off his jacket, and settled into the chair with the focused air of a man returning to something he had left mid-thought. He glanced at the surface of the desk. The pause that followed was brief, perhaps 2 seconds, not long enough for most people to register. Mara registered it. Victor opened the top left drawer, looked at its contents with the same unreadable expression he brought to most things, and then closed it again without comment. He did not look at her directly. But after a moment, in the same even, unhurried tone he had used on Wednesday, he said, "Thank you, Mara." It was the first time he had used her name. She did not break her rhythm, did not turn around, did not allow the single sharp note that rang through her chest at the sound of it to reach the surface of her expression by even a fraction. "Of course," she said simply, and the room returned to its silence. But something inside it had shifted, something small, something that would have been easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Victor Bianchi was paying attention. He always had been. What Mara did not know, as she packed her cart and left the 3rd floor that Saturday, was that the document had not been left there by accident. It had been placed there deliberately by a man who had decided, after 3 days of watching, that it was time to find out exactly what kind of woman she was. And she had just given him his answer. Mara passed Victor's first test without flinching. She found the sensitive document he had deliberately left exposed, returned it without a word, and earned 2 things she had not been looking for: his trust and his first use of her name. But Victor Bianchi is not a man who stops at the first answer when the question is still interesting. And the library is about to become the room where pretending stops being an available option for either of them. The week that followed the document had a different quality to it. Not louder, not more eventful. If anything, the surface of things remained exactly as composed and routine as it had always been, the kind of calm that the Bianchi estate wore the way certain people wear expensive clothes, as a statement rather than a reflection of what was actually happening underneath. But something had shifted in the architecture of Mara's mornings. And she felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky has done anything visible to confirm it. Victor was different with her. Not warmer exactly, because warmth implied a softening, and nothing about the man suggested he was capable of softening in any direction that mattered. It was more that the careful, measuring distance he had kept during that first week had been quietly retired, replaced with something closer and considerably less comfortable to stand inside. He spoke to her more. Small things, a comment about the rain against the study window, a question about whether the new supply of desk oil had arrived, a single dry observation about a junior staff member that was just funny enough to require her to work to keep her expression straight. That last one had surprised her most. She had not expected him to be funny. She had not budgeted for that at all, and it annoyed her in a way she could not entirely rationalize. It was far easier to maintain appropriate professional distance from a man who was simply powerful and cold and remote. It was considerably harder when that same man occasionally said something that made the corner of her mouth want to do something she hadn't given it permission to do. She managed it, but it was costing her more effort with each passing day. By the following Thursday, her assignment had been quietly extended to include the private library, a long, high-ceilinged room adjacent to the study, lined floor to ceiling with more books than a man running a criminal empire had any reasonable right to have read, and smelling faintly of leather and old paper in a way that Mara, against her better judgment, found entirely too comfortable. She arrived at the library that Thursday afternoon to find it empty. She worked through the first hour without incident, moving along the upper shelves with the small rolling ladder the room provided, methodical and unhurried, the afternoon light coming in flat and gray through the tall windows. She did not hear him come in. That was the thing about Victor Bianchi in his own home. He moved through it with a quietness that had nothing to do with stealth and everything to do with ownership. The way a person stops announcing themselves in spaces that have long since learned to arrange themselves around their presence. Mara became aware of him the same way she had that first night in the corridor, not by sound, but by the specific change in atmosphere that preceded him the way a drop in temperature precedes a storm. She turned on the ladder and found him standing near the center of the room, hands in his pockets, watching her with the patient, considering expression she had by now catalogued in considerable detail without meaning to. She came down from the ladder. "I didn't hear you," she said, because saying nothing would have been its own kind of statement. "I know," Victor replied. He did not move from where he stood, but the room was not large enough for that to be a comfort, and they both understood it without either of them acknowledging it. Mara reached for her cloth and turned back to the lower shelf, applying herself to a row of thick, dark-spined volumes, with the focused energy of someone who has decided that productivity is the best available armor. She heard him take 2 steps. Then 2 more. He stopped close enough that, when she turned slightly to reach the next section of shelf, she found him standing at the edge of her peripheral vision, no longer across the room, no longer at a distance that could be described as incidental. "Mara," he said. She turned to look at him, because not turning would have been worse. Up close, in the gray afternoon light of the library, with no desk between them and no professional geometry to hide behind, Victor Bianchi was exactly as difficult to look at directly as she had always suspected he would be. Not because he was doing anything in particular, but because he wasn't, and somehow that was the more demanding version. "I want you to say it again," he said. The words landed without preamble, without softening, in the same even tone he used for everything, which made them considerably more effective than if he had whispered them. Mara held his gaze for a moment before she answered. "Say what?" she replied, not as a question, because they were both well past the point where pretending not to understand was a viable option. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the distant relative of one. "You know what?" Victor said quietly. The library was very still. Mara could feel the warmth of standing this close to another person in a cold room, could feel the specific quality of attention he was directing at her, with the patience of someone who had already decided he was willing to wait as long as the situation required. Her chin lifted slightly, that small, involuntary gesture that surfaced whenever the part of her that refused to be cornered decided to make itself known. "I meant it," she said. Not the exact words he had asked for, but the truest version of them. Something moved behind his eyes, brief, contained, and gone before she could name it with any certainty. He held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he stepped back, reached past her to the shelf, straightened a book that had not needed straightening, and moved toward the door with the unhurried ease of a man who had just gotten considerably more than he had visibly asked for. He stopped at the threshold. "Finish the east shelf," he said, without turning around. "The spines on the second row are uneven." And then he was gone. Mara stood in the middle of the library with her cloth in her hand, and her heart conducting itself in a manner she found entirely unprofessional, staring at a row of books she could no longer name a single title of. She turned back to the shelf. She straightened every spine on the second row, with extreme and unnecessary precision. It was the only thing she could think to do with her hands. Neither of them spoke about what had happened in the library. But from that afternoon forward, the space between Mara Vesci and Victor Bianchi was never quite the same size it had been before. The library incident, as Mara had taken to calling it privately, had rearranged something in the daily rhythm of the estate that she could not quite put back the way it was. Not dramatically, not in any way the casual observer would have noticed, but in the small, structural ways that mattered most to a woman who had built her entire sense of safety inside this house on the understanding that she knew exactly how each day was going to behave before it started. She no longer entirely knew that. Victor had not referenced what had happened in the library, had not pushed further or retreated entirely, had simply continued to exist in her orbit with that same composed, watchful quality that she was beginning to suspect was less a personality trait and more a deliberate strategy. The kind of patience that certain men deploy not because they are uncertain, but because they have already made their decision and are simply enjoying the distance between that decision and the moment they act on it. That understanding did not make things easier. What it did was make her sharper, more alert in the private hours when she was away from the third floor and the particular gravitational pull of a room that contained him. She threw herself into the rest of her duties with the energy of someone who needed to remember that she had a job that existed outside of 2 rooms on the third floor and the complicated interior, whether of one very dangerous man. Which is how she found herself in the kitchens on Friday evening. The kitchens at the Bianchi estate ran on a different energy from the rest of the house, louder, warmer, carrying the organized chaos of a small professional operation that catered to the various moving parts of an estate this size. Mara had gone down to collect the supply log for the weekend inventory, a task that would take 10 minutes and required nothing more demanding than a signature and a clipboard. She had her clipboard, she had her signature, and she was in the middle of a perfectly unremarkable exit when Marco stepped into the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the pantry store and made her path considerably more complicated. Marco had been a security fixture at the estate for about 4 months, which was long enough for him to have grown comfortable, and not long enough for him to have developed the particular understanding that the longer-serving staff carried in their bones. The understanding of exactly how much latitude this house extended to people, and precisely where that latitude ended. He was large, casually confident in the way that men become when their physical size has spent years being mistaken for permission. And he had been directing a specific quality of attention at Mara for the past several weeks that she had been managing with the efficient, low-drama deflection she applied to most inconveniences. A clipped response here, a deliberately occupied exit there, the consistent and unmistakable body language of a woman who was not interested and was not going to become interested regardless of how many times the question was posed. Marco, it turned out, was not fluent in that particular language. He blocked the corridor with the relaxed posture of someone who had not yet encountered a consequence significant enough to adjust his behavior, and said something low and close that Mara did not dignify with a response. When she moved to step past him, his hand closed around her wrist. Not violently, but with the specific, testing firmness of someone checking to see how much they can get away with before they recalibrate. Mara went very still. Not from fear, but from the cold, focused clarity that replaced fear in her when a situation required her to think faster than it was moving. She was calculating the distance to the kitchen door, the likelihood of anyone being within earshot, the precise response that would extract her from this corridor cleanly and without a scene that would cost her more than it cost him. She did not get the chance to deploy any of it. The change in Marco's expression happened before she heard anything. His eyes lifted to somewhere above and behind her, and the confidence drained out of his face with a speed that would have been almost interesting to observe under different circumstances. He released her wrist. Mara turned. Victor was standing at the end of the corridor. He had not announced himself, had not raised his voice, was not visibly armed, and was doing nothing more physically dramatic than standing still and looking at Marco with an expression so utterly devoid of emotion that it was somehow more frightening than anything louder would have been. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Victor said very quietly, "Get out." Marco left. Not quickly enough to appear panicked, but quickly enough to make clear that the option of staying had already been removed from the available choices before the sentence finished. Victor's gaze moved to Mara. He crossed the corridor in a few unhurried steps and stopped in front of her, his eyes moving briefly to her wrist, then back to her face, with an attention that was clinical on the surface and something considerably less clinical underneath. "Did he hurt you?" he said. 3 words arranged as a question, but delivered with the quiet intensity of someone whose follow-up action depended entirely on the answer. "No," Myra said. She held his gaze steadily, because looking away felt like a concession she was not prepared to make, especially here, especially now, in a corridor that had just made the power dynamics of this house uncomfortably physical in a way she had spent 2 years keeping theoretical. Victor looked at her for a moment longer than the question required. Then he reached out and, with 2 fingers, adjusted the sleeve of her uniform over her wrist with a precision so deliberate and so quiet that it stopped every coherent thought she was in the middle of having. He dropped his hand. "Marco will not be returning on Monday," he said simply. Mara processed that sentence and everything it contained. "Victor," she started. "Go back upstairs," he said, not unkindly, but in the tone of a man who has finished the conversation he intended to have and is not available for the one she is about to propose instead. He stepped aside and gave her the corridor. Mara walked past him, clipboard in hand, spine straight, every external signal broadcasting a composure she had to work considerably harder than usual to maintain. She was 3 steps past him when his voice reached her one more time, low and even and carrying no particular inflection at all. "Myra." She stopped but did not turn. "Next time," Victor said, "come to me first." She did not respond. She walked to the end of the corridor, turned the corner, and stood on the other side of it for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling, doing the quiet, invisible work of putting herself back together. The ember that she had been managing with such disciplined consistency for the past 2 weeks was no longer something she could reasonably describe as an ember. It had graduated, without her permission, into something considerably more difficult to contain. And the most inconvenient part, the part she turned over in her mind for the rest of that evening and most of the night, was not that Victor had intervened. It was how certain she was, with every sharp and honest instinct she possessed, that his reaction in that corridor had had very little to do with the professional obligations of a man protecting his staff. Marco cleared his belongings from the security quarters by Sunday morning. Nobody asked why. In the Bianchi estate, certain exits required no explanation, and every person on staff understood, without being told, exactly whose decision it had been. Marco's absence settled over the estate like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were quiet, but they traveled far, and by Monday afternoon, every member of staff had registered them in their own way, some with relief, some with the careful, sideways unease of people who understood that the removal of one problem in a house like this rarely arrived without the quiet installation of a new one. Mara registered it the only way she registered most things inside these walls. She noted it, filed it, and kept moving. What she could not as easily file away was the corridor itself. The memory of 2 fingers adjusting her sleeve with a care so deliberate it had no business belonging to a man who ran his world with the emotional temperature of a midwinter morning. She had replayed it more times than she intended to admit, and each time it arrived with the same effect, a precise, unwelcome warmth that started somewhere behind her sternum and radiated outward before she could organize a proper defense against it. She was still managing it, but the margin was narrowing. The note arrived on Tuesday. It was not slipped into a schedule this time. It was delivered directly to her by one of Victor's personal staff, a composed, silver-haired woman named Giulia who functioned as the human equivalent of a closed door, revealing nothing about what was behind her and making no apology for it. Giulia handed Mara a small cream envelope, said Mr. Bianchi requests your presence at 7 this evening, the East sitting room, and walked away before Mara had fully processed the first half of the sentence. Mara opened the envelope. Inside was a single card, the kind of heavy, textured paper that announces its own expense simply by existing, and on it, 3 lines written in a hand that was spare and deliberate and entirely unsurprised by itself. There is a function Wednesday evening. You will attend. Giulia will come to you at 5. No question mark, no request, no acknowledgement of the significant gap between house cleaner and function attendee that most reasonable people would have felt the need to at least gesture toward. Mara read it twice. She turned it over, as though the back of the card might contain a more negotiable version of the same information. It did not. She arrived at the East sitting room at 7 to find Victor standing at the window with a glass of something amber, looking out at the grounds with the distant expression of a man finishing a thought he had started somewhere else. He turned when she entered, looked at her for a moment in the way he always did, as though reading a page he had already half memorized, and gestured to the chair across from where he stood. Mara sat, because standing would have been a performance of a composure she was already working to maintain without the added theater. Wednesday, Victor said, settling into the chair opposite, is not optional. I understand that, Mara replied evenly. What I don't fully understand is why. Something moved at the corner of his expression, not quite amusement, but the distant cousin of it. Because I want you there, he said, with the simple, unornamented directness of a man who had long since stopped dressing his intentions in language designed to make other people comfortable. Mara held that sentence at arm's length for a moment, examining it. I'm a house cleaner, she said. Not on Wednesday, Victor replied. There was no cruelty in it, no condescension, just the flat, certain delivery of someone rearranging facts to suit a decision that had already been finalized before she walked into the room. He stood, set down his glass, and moved to the door with the unhurried purpose that characterized every physical transition he made. Giulia will handle everything, he said. Wear your hair down. And in the manner she was rapidly learning to recognize as his preferred method of concluding conversations that he considered complete, he left. Giulia arrived at Mara's door at 5 on Wednesday with the punctuality of someone for whom lateness was a personal offense, and carrying a dress bag with the careful, two-handed reverence of someone transporting something irreplaceable. She laid it across the bed, unzipped it without ceremony, and stepped back. Mara looked at the dress for a long moment. It was the color of deep midnight, structured at the shoulders and fluid everywhere else, made of a fabric that moved with the quiet authority of something that had not been produced in any volume and had not been purchased anywhere with a visible price tag. She reached out and touched the hem. The fabric responded to her fingers with the kind of softness that a person only encounters in things that cost more than they are prepared to think about directly. How much? Mara said, not entirely meaning to say it out loud. Giulia looked at her with the expression of someone who has been asked a question they consider beside the point. More than is relevant to tonight, she said simply, and produced a pair of shoes from a second bag that suggested the dress had not been sent alone. Mara dressed in silence, and when she stood in front of the mirror, she was confronted with the specific discomfort of looking like a version of herself she had not previously met. Not unrecognizable, her face was still her face, her posture still the composed, upright carriage she had always carried. But the woman in the mirror had been removed from the context of navy blue uniform and supply carts and corridor schedules, and placed into a setting that fit her considerably better than it had any right to. That realization was its own small crisis. Victor was waiting at the foot of the main staircase. He looked up as she descended, and for exactly 2 seconds, the unreadable expression he maintained with such disciplined consistency did something she had never seen it do before. It cracked slightly at the edges. He recovered it almost immediately. "You look appropriate," he said. Mara reached the bottom step and looked at him with the dry steadiness that surfaced in her whenever a situation required her to push back against something without raising her voice. "High praise," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in that way it occasionally did, the ghost of something warmer than his usual register, gone before it fully arrived. He offered his arm. Mara took it, because declining would have cost her more composure than accepting, and composure was the only currency she had left this evening that she could afford to spend carefully. The car was waiting outside, and as it pulled through the estate gates and into the dark city beyond, Mara understood, with the quiet, sinking certainty of someone watching the last familiar landmark slide out of view, that she had just crossed a border she would not easily be permitted to recross. The house cleaner had been left at the top of that staircase. The woman on Victor Bianch's arm was someone else entirely, and the world she was being driven into had not been designed with easy exits. She had wished for this, in some form, in some reckless and unguarded version of herself that whispered things in midnight corridors. The trouble with wishes, as Mara Vesci was beginning to understand, was that the ones that came true were almost always more expensive than the ones that didn't. Victor provided Mara with a dress that cost more than her yearly salary, guided her down the main staircase on his arm, and drove her into the city to sit beside him at a private dinner with men who had built their lives on the ability to read a room and exploit whatever they found there. Mara held herself magnificently. But across the candle-lit table, a man named Dominic Reyes was doing arithmetic. And the answer he arrived at is about to change the shape of everything. The venue was not what Mara had expected, though she was not entirely sure what she had expected. Something louder, perhaps, or more visibly dangerous. The kind of setting that announced its own threat level clearly enough that a person knew exactly where to position their guard before they walked through the door. What she found instead was a private dining room on the 14th floor of a building that wore its power the same way Victor wore his, quietly, expensively, and with the complete absence of any need to prove itself to anyone present. Dark wood paneling, candlelight that had been calibrated to flatter rather than illuminate. A table set for 12, with the kind of precision that suggested the staff responsible, for it had been briefed on the preferences of every person expected to sit at it. 8 men were already present when they arrived. Mara clocked them in the first 30 seconds, the way they held themselves, the specific quality of ease that each of them projected, the slight, almost imperceptible recalibration that moved through the room like a current when Victor entered it. These were not men who were accustomed to adjusting themselves for anyone. They adjusted for Victor. She filed that away with everything else she had been quietly collecting about the precise geography of his power, and kept her expression exactly where it needed to be, composed, present, and entirely unbothered by the fact that she was the only woman in a room full of men who looked like they had collectively ordered the removal of several problems over the course of their respective careers. Victor guided her to the seat on his immediate right, with a hand at the small of her back that was light enough to be incidental and deliberate enough to be anything but. The message it sent to the room required no translation. The first hour moved with the particular, surface-level civility of powerful men conducting business, in a setting designed to make the business feel like leisure. Conversation flowed in 3 languages across the table. Courses arrived and were replaced with the invisible efficiency of well-trained staff, and Mara sat with her wine barely touched and her attention carefully distributed, present enough to fulfill whatever role Victor had assigned her this evening, observant enough to understand the room she was actually sitting inside. Victor spoke sparingly, as he always did, with the economy of a man who understood that in rooms like this, every word was a piece of currency, and the wealthiest person was usually the one who spent the least. He addressed her twice during the meal, once to ask, in a tone pitched for the table rather than just for her, whether she preferred the lamb, and once to lean close and say something low enough that only she could hear it, which she understood immediately was less about the content of what he said and more about the visual it created for the men watching. She responded to both with the natural ease of someone who had decided, somewhere between the staircase and the car ride over, that if she was going to be in this room, then she was going to be in it fully and without the appearance of someone who required rescue from it. She felt the eyes on her throughout. Most of them she could account for the open appraisal of men encountering an unfamiliar variable in a familiar setting, interest that was transactional and brief, and moved on once it had gathered what it needed. One pair of eyes did not move on. His name, she would learn later, was Dominic Reyes. He sat 3 seats down on the opposite side of the table, younger than most of the men present by perhaps a decade, with the angular, watchful face of someone who had arrived at his current position not through inheritance, but through the kind of relentless, calculating ambition that left very little room for sentiment and a great deal of room for strategy. He was handsome in a cold, architectural way that Mara suspected he was aware of and had learned to deploy with reasonable effectiveness. More importantly, he was intelligent. She recognized it in the way he listened, not waiting for his turn to speak the way most people did, but actually absorbing the room, cataloging its contents, running some internal calculation she could not read the output of but could clearly see was running. He had looked at her when she first sat down, the way everyone had. But where the others had looked and moved on, Dominic Reyes had looked and stayed. Not in the manner of Marco, not with anything that invited the kind of cold, focused clarity she had deployed in that kitchen corridor. This was different, and in some ways more concerning, because it was entirely impersonal. He was not looking at her. He was looking at what she represented. She watched him arrive at whatever conclusion his calculation had been building toward. Saw the small, subtle adjustment in his expression that meant he had finished processing and filed his result, and felt the specific chill of understanding that she had just been categorized in a way that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the man seated to her left. She did not look away. She held Reyes's gaze for precisely long enough to register that she had noticed him noticing, and then she turned back to the table with the unhurried composure of someone who has made their point without raising their voice. Beside her, she felt rather than saw Victor's attention shift, a fractional turn of his focus that lasted less than a second and communicated, without a single word or gesture, that he had observed the entire exchange. His hand, resting on the table, moved an inch closer to hers. He did not touch her, but the distance between them narrowed in a way that was visible to anyone paying attention, and Dominic Reyes, Mara had already established, was paying very close attention to everything. The dinner concluded with the civilized, unhurried efficiency of a gathering whose participants had said everything they intended to say long before the dessert course arrived. Coats were retrieved, brief and immaculate farewells exchanged, and the room began its quiet dissolution. Reyes was the last to approach Victor before leaving. They exchanged the measured, surface-level pleasantries of men who respect each other's capabilities without trusting them in any direction, and when Reyes turned to acknowledge Mara, he did so with a smile that was perfectly constructed and entirely hollow at its center. "A pleasure," he said smoothly. "Likewise," Mara replied, with the same quality of warmth, which was to say precisely none. His smile held for a moment longer than necessary, the smile of a man registering an answer he found more interesting than the one he had anticipated, and then he was gone. The room emptied. Victor stood at the window for a moment with his back to her, looking down at the city below with the stillness of a man completing a calculation of his own. Then he turned. "You handled that well," he said. "Which part?" Mara asked. "All of it," Victor replied. He reached for his jacket and said nothing further on the subject. But the line between his brows had deepened by a fraction, in the specific way she had begun to recognize as the physical register of something he was thinking about and had not yet decided to share. She did not push. The car arrived downstairs. The city moved past them in the dark, and Mara sat beside Victor in a silence that had changed its quality again, heavier now, carrying something it had not been loaded with on the way there. She understood why. She had seen the look on Dominic Reyes's face when he finished his calculation at the dinner table, and she was sharp enough, honest enough, to understand exactly what conclusion he had reached. Victor Bianchi had brought something to that room that he had never brought before. And in the cold, strategic arithmetic of men like Reyes, that something had just been identified as the most exploitable thing in the room. Not a woman. A weakness. Mara had walked into that building as a variable nobody had accounted for. She left it as a target. And the most dangerous part was that only one person at that table had seen it coming before it arrived, and he was sitting beside her in the dark, saying nothing, with the particular expression of a man who has just been reminded that even the most controlled game has a moment where the board stops cooperating. Dominic Reyes looked across a dinner table and saw not a woman but a vulnerability, the one soft point in the otherwise impenetrable armor of Victor Bianchi. Mara saw it too. And unlike Victor, she has no soldiers, no leverage, and no history of surviving the kind of attention that men like Reyes direct at people they have identified as useful. She has one tool remaining. She is going to use it now. She made the decision in the car on the way home. Not impulsively. Mara did not make impulsive decisions, or at least that was what she had always told herself, conveniently setting aside the fact that the entire reason she was sitting in this car, in this dress, returning from a dinner with men who collected enemies the way other people collected assets, was a single impulsive sentence whispered in a corridor 3 weeks ago. But this decision felt different. This one had been arriving for several days, building quietly in the background of every interaction, every corridor, every room on the 3rd floor, and the dinner this evening had simply been the moment it finished constructing itself and presented its conclusion in terms she could no longer negotiate around. Dominic Reyes had looked at her across that table and seen a liability. And the cold, honest, self-preserving part of Mara, the part that had kept her intact through things considerably harder than a complicated attraction to a dangerous man, knew with absolute clarity that Reyes was not wrong. She was a liability. Not because she was weak, and not because she was foolish, but because she had allowed herself to be seen, and in the world that Victor Bianchi occupied, being seen by the wrong people was not a personal inconvenience. It was a life-threatening condition. She submitted her resignation the following morning. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no confrontation, no speech she had spent the night rehearsing. She wrote it the way she did most things, cleanly and without excess, a single typed page left on Giulia's desk before 8 in the morning, outlining her final available date, her gratitude for the position, and nothing that could be read between the lines because she had been extremely careful to leave nothing between them. She felt steady doing it. Steadier than she had felt since the night of the corridor, which she took as confirmation that she was making the right decision for the right reasons, and that the discomfort she was also feeling simultaneously was simply the price of sense, which had never in the history of human experience been entirely painless. She went about her morning shift with the focused composure of someone who has resolved an internal argument and is now simply waiting for the administrative side of that resolution to process. She was on the 2nd floor landing, working through the guest linen rotation with Alina, when Giulia appeared at the top of the stairs. "Mr. Bianchi would like to see you," Giulia said. The specific neutrality of her expression communicated that she had read the resignation letter, had delivered it as was her function, and had an entirely private opinion about its contents that she had no intention of sharing with anyone. Elena looked at Mara. Mara handed her the linen stack and followed Giulia downstairs. Victor was in the study. Not at his desk this time, but standing at the window the way he had been standing at the window of that 14th floor dining room the previous evening, looking outward with the contained, deliberate stillness of a man processing something he has not yet decided how to handle. He turned when she entered. Her resignation letter was on the desk. He did not look at it. He looked at her. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand," Mara replied. Something moved in his expression, not irritation exactly, but the acknowledgement of it held at a distance. He did not push the point. "You are leaving because of last night," he said. It was not a question, which meant he already understood the answer and had brought her here not to establish the reason but to do something about it. "I'm leaving because last night clarified something I should have been clearer about weeks ago," Mara said, with the even, direct delivery of someone who has rehearsed this enough to mean it without performing it. "Which is," Victor said. "That I don't belong in that room," she said. "I don't belong in that world, and I was foolish enough to let things drift far enough in that direction that a man I have never met now knows my face and has already decided what to do with it." Victor was quiet for a moment. "Rays will not touch you," he said. "You don't know that," Mara replied. "I do," Victor said, in the tone of someone for whom that sentence carried a weight of specific and non-theoretical meaning. "And even if that were true," Mara said, holding her ground with the particular composure of a woman who has made a decision and is refusing to be argued out of it by the exact person she most needs to be argued out of it by. "It doesn't change the fact that I came to this house to do a job, and somewhere between the study and the library and a corridor in the kitchen, and a dress that costs more than I earn in a year, the job became something else." She stopped. She had not intended to say that much. Victor watched her finish, waited a full beat of silence after she was done, and then moved away from the window in that unhurried way he had, not closing the distance between them entirely, but enough. "Mara," he said. "Don't," she said quietly, because she knew what was coming and she needed to not hear it in his voice, in that register, at this particular distance. Victor stopped. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the measuring look, not the patient, strategic attention she had catalogued across 3 weeks of shared rooms and deliberate silences. This was something that had slipped past all of that. Something unguarded, briefly but unmistakably, in the same way the expression on his face at the bottom of the staircase last night had cracked at its edges before he recovered it. "I cannot let you go back to being a ghost," he said. The words arrived quietly and landed with a weight entirely disproportionate to their volume. Mara looked at him for a long moment. "That's not your decision," she said. "No," Victor agreed. He held her gaze steadily, with the honesty of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not planned to arrive and had decided, upon finding himself there, not to pretend otherwise. "It isn't," he said. "But I am asking you." The room held that sentence between them like something fragile and specific that neither of them was entirely prepared for, least of all Victor, who she suspected had not asked for very many things in his life, without the structural advantage of already knowing the answer. Mara looked at the resignation letter on the desk. She thought about the corridor, the library, the kitchen, the dress, the car, and the cold architectural expression of a man at a candlelit table doing the mathematics of her vulnerability. She thought about the ember she had been managing for 3 weeks, and the degree to which it had long since stopped being manageable by any reasonable definition of the word. She looked back at Victor. "If I stay," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something." Victor waited. "I am not a possession," she said. "I am not a fixture in your world. I am not a variable you move around a board. And I am not something you acquire because it interested you and then set down when it stops." Victor held her gaze through all of it without flinching, which was either a very good sign or a very dangerous one, and Mara was honest enough with herself to acknowledge she was no longer entirely sure of the difference where he was concerned. "I understand," he said. "Not easily, not quickly, but with the measured, deliberate weight of a man who means what he says specifically, because he says very little. Mara stood in the middle of the study for a moment longer. Then she reached across the desk, picked up the resignation letter, and folded it once along its existing crease. She held it at her side. "The east shelf in the library needs finishing," she said. And she walked out. The resignation letter, as far as anyone ever knew, was never submitted. What happened in that study stayed in that study, as most things in the Bianchi estate eventually did. But Alina, who knew Mara better than anyone in that house, and had spent 3 weeks watching the careful, composed architecture of her friend's self-control develop several significant cracks, looked at Mara's face when she returned to the second-floor landing and asked no questions at all. She simply handed back the linen stack and said nothing, which, between the two of them, had always been the loudest possible answer. The resignation letter burned in her jacket pocket for 3 days. Not literally, but in the way that unresolved things have a physical presence, a weight that announces itself at inconvenient moments, a density that makes itself known precisely when you are trying hardest to ignore it. Mara had not thrown it away. She had not resubmitted it either. She had simply carried it, which she recognized as its own kind of answer to a question she had not yet found the language to ask out loud. The estate had settled into a new configuration in the days following the study, one that everyone on staff could feel, but nobody was nomming. The way you feel a structural change in a building without being able to point to the specific wall that moved. Victor had not pushed. He had not retreated either. He had simply continued to exist in her orbit with that same composed, watchful presence, except that the careful, strategic distance of the early weeks was entirely gone now, replaced with a proximity that had stopped pretending to be incidental. He found reasons to be in the same room. Not manufactured ones, nothing that could be identified as performance, but the small, natural gravitational adjustments of a man who has stopped engineering space between himself and something he wants and has quietly accepted the consequences of that. Mara felt it with every honest instinct she possessed. And every honest instinct she possessed had stopped pretending not to. It was a Thursday evening when it happened. The house was quieter than usual. Several staff had been given the evening off for reasons Giulia had communicated without elaboration, and the particular quality of stillness that settled over the estate was the specific kind that felt less like emptiness and more like intention. Mara was in the library. She had not been sent there, had not been scheduled there. She had simply gone, the way you return without thinking to the room where something important happened, the way the body remembers certain coordinates long after the mind has tried to reroute itself. She was not cleaning. She was standing at the far end of the room near the tall window, looking out at the grounds below, where the last of the evening light was finishing its slow departure from the sky. And she was doing the thing she had been doing with increasing frequency and decreasing success over the past several days. She was being honest with herself. Not about what she wanted. She had been honest about that since the corridor, since the library, since the kitchen, since the staircase, since the car ride home from a dinner where she had held the gaze of a dangerous man and understood with perfect clarity what her presence in that room meant to him. She was being honest about what staying meant. She heard him before she saw him this time. The quiet, deliberate footfall that had become as recognizable to her as a voice, unhurried, certain, carrying the particular quality of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has stopped requiring the destination to justify itself. Victor came to stand beside her at the window. Not behind her, not across the room, not at the managed distance of a man still running calculations. Beside her, close enough that the warmth of standing next to another person in the cooling evening air of a high-ceilinged room was no longer an abstract observation, but a physical, specific, undeniable fact. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Outside, the last edge of light dissolved into dark. "You're still here," Victor said. "I'm still here," Mara confirmed. Another silence, shorter this time, carrying the particular weight of two people standing at the edge of something they have both been approaching from different directions for long enough that the arrival feels less like a surprise and more like the completion of a sentence that started weeks ago in a dim corridor at midnight. Victor turned to look at her. Mara turned to look at him. And whatever remained of the careful, composed, professionally maintained distance she had been constructing and reinforcing and patching back together since the first morning she walked into this library. It finished, quietly and without drama, like a door that has been held open against the wind for a very long time, and finally, simply, let's go. She had wished for this. In a corridor, in a whisper, to the wrong audience, at the worst possible time, she had said out loud that she would risk everything for this. And now here it was, assembled from 3 weeks of restrained tension and small, precise moments, and the particular honesty of two people who had both spent long enough being alone inside their own competence that the presence of someone equally formidable had become, against all practical judgment, something neither of them could walk away from. Victor raised his hand and touched her face with the same deliberate, unhurried care he brought to everything. 2 fingers at her jaw, the same quiet precision as the corridor, except this time there was no uniform sleeve to adjust and no professional distance left to maintain the pretense of. Mara reached up and took the resignation letter from her jacket pocket. She held it between them for a moment. Then she set it on the window ledge and left it there. Victor looked at it, then back at her. And the expression on his face was the fully completed version of every partial thing she had been catching glimpses of for 3 weeks, unguarded, certain, and warmer than she had let herself believe he was capable of. He leaned down. She did not move away. What happened in the library that Thursday evening belonged entirely to the 2 people in it. What Mara could say, lying awake much later in the particular stillness of a house that had rearranged itself irrevocably around her, was that it had been worth every carefully constructed wall she had spent 3 weeks building and every deliberate, patient brick he had spent 3 weeks removing. She had wished for one night. She had not wished carefully enough. Because one night with Victor Bianchi was not a conclusion. It was a beginning, the kind that rewrites everything that came before it and makes certain, in the quiet and unhurried manner of all truly permanent things, that there is no honest version of going back. She lay in the dark and understood, with every sharp, clear, wide-awake instinct she possessed, that the woman who had whispered 7 reckless words in a corridor 3 weeks ago had gotten exactly what she asked for, and that the cost of it was only just beginning to arrive. She reached for the resignation letter on the window ledge. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she let it go and watched it fall into the dark below. By the time the first light came through the library window, Mara Vesci had stopped being the woman who cleaned the rooms of the Bianchi estate. She was something else now, something the estate itself had not yet finished deciding how to accommodate. Something that Dominic Reyes, 3 miles across the city, had already accounted for. And something that, by morning, would have a very specific and very dangerous message waiting for it on the cold marble floor of the East Corridor. The morning arrived the way dangerous things often do. Quietly, without announcement, wearing the ordinary face of just another day, until it was close enough that ordinary was no longer an available description. Mara was awake before the light had fully committed to the sky, not because she had slept badly, but because she had barely slept at all, and the thin hours between the library and dawn had been spent in the specific, wide-awake clarity of someone whose life has just changed shape, and who is still tracing the new edges of it with careful, wondering fingers. She lay still for a long while, listening to the estate breathe around her. Victor had said very little before she left the library. He had said enough. The particular quality of silence he had wrapped around her before she went, the hand at the back of her head, the unhurried, certain pressure of it, had communicated more than a carefully constructed sentence would have managed, and she had carried it back to her room the way you carry something you are afraid to set down in case it turns out to have been fragile. She dressed at 6. She told herself it was routine. She was halfway down the east corridor when she saw it. She stopped. Her mind registered what her eyes were seeing in pieces, the way the brain sometimes processes things that don't belong in the world it has organized. Slowly, out of sequence, assembling the complete picture with a reluctance that felt almost protective. A single white envelope, placed with deliberate precision in the dead center of the corridor floor. Not dropped, not slid, placed, with the particular care of someone who wanted it found and wanted it understood that the finding of it was intentional. Her name was written on the front. Not her full name. Just Mara. In handwriting she did not recognize, in ink that was an ordinary blue except for the edges of the letters, where something darker had bled into the paper in a way that took her a moment too long to identify. She crouched down and looked at it without touching it, and the cold that moved through her in that moment had nothing to do with the temperature of the corridor. It was not ink bleeding at the edges. She stood up. She did not open the envelope. She walked directly to the study. Victor was already awake. He was at his desk, jacket on, the contained, operational stillness of a man who had been awake for some time and had been doing something purposeful with those hours. And when Mara entered without knocking, which she had never done before, he looked up with the immediate, focused attention of someone whose instincts had shifted into a register that had nothing to do with the quiet warmth of the library the night before. She told him about the envelope without preamble. She described it precisely, the placement, the handwriting, the edges of the letters. She did not need to describe it further. Victor was on his feet before she finished the second sentence, and the man who crossed the study toward the door was not the man who had looked at her in the window light the previous evening, with an expression she had spent years convincing herself he was not capable of. This was the other version. The one the city feared. The one that men like Dominic Reyes had built their strategies around. He stopped at the door and turned back to her with the controlled, precise authority of someone issuing an instruction that was not open to interpretation. "Stay in this room," he said. "Victor," she started. "Stay in this room, Mara." She stayed. The next 20 minutes were the longest she had spent inside the Bianchi estate, including the night she had first walked into it. She heard movement in the corridor, measured, efficient, the specific quality of organized response that told her Victor had not gone to the east corridor alone and had not needed to make more than one phone call to ensure that. She stood at the window of the study and looked out at the grounds below and did something she had not allowed herself to do in 3 weeks of careful, composed, internally managed survival inside this house. She acknowledged, without filters and without the protective scaffolding of practicality she usually kept assembled around her more honest thoughts, exactly what last night had cost her. Not in regret. She could not find regret in any honest corner of herself, which was its own kind of answer. But in understanding. She had walked into the Bianchi estate 2 years ago as a woman with no attachments, no visibility, and no enemies. She had survived on the strength of those 3 absences. She had none of them now. Victor returned to the study 11 minutes later. He closed the door, set the unopened envelope on the desk without looking at it, and stood across the room from her with an expression that had been stripped of everything except a directness she recognized as the most honest version of him she had yet encountered. "It was Reyes," he said. Mara had known that before he said it. "What was in the envelope?" she asked. Victor looked at her for a moment, that look, the reading look, except this time it was not measuring her for information, but for something closer to the thing he had shown her at the window the night before. "A photograph," he said. "Of you." The weight of those 3 words settled into the room like something physical. "Taken here," Victor continued, "inside the estate grounds." Mara processed that. She processed all of it, the placement of the envelope, the deliberate precision of it, the handwriting, the edges of the letters, and now this, now the understanding that Reyes had been close enough, had positioned someone close enough, To watch her inside the one place she had spent 2 years believing was, for all its dangers, the one environment she understood well enough to navigate. She had been wrong. She looked at Victor. "You told me Reyes wouldn't touch me," she said. "He hasn't," Victor replied. "Yet," Mara said. The word sat between them with the clean, unsparing honesty of someone who has stopped softening her assessments for the comfort of either party. Victor crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the proximity carried the memory of the library alongside the weight of the present moment, and looked at her with the full, unguarded attention of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not planned and had decided, without reservation, to remain. "He won't," Victor said. Not as reassurance. He was too precise a man for empty reassurance, and she was too sharp a woman to be comforted by it. He said it as a statement of intent, in the same quiet, absolute register he used for things he had already decided and would not be revisiting. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about ghosts. She thought about the woman she had been when she walked into this estate, careful, contained, invisible by design, surviving on the clean, uncomplicated safety of being nobody to everyone. She thought about the corridor, the library, the study, the dress. The dinner, and a Thursday evening in the last light of a high-ceilinged room where she had let go of a letter and watched it fall into the dark. She had risked everything. The wish had been granted in full, with the particular thoroughness of things that don't arrive halfway. And now here was the cost, not abstract, not theoretical, not the whispered warning of a sensible inner voice she could choose to ignore. It was a white envelope on a marble floor. It was her name, in someone else's handwriting. It was the cold, clarifying understanding that the woman who had stepped out of the shadows had become, in doing so, something that powerful men in dangerous rooms could see and reach for. She was no longer a ghost. She had known that since the staircase. What she understood now, with a completeness she had not been ready for until this exact moment, standing in this room, in the full gravity of everything the morning had delivered, was that she had also stopped being safe. And that Victor Bianchi, the man responsible for both of those truths, was looking at her with the kind of certainty that asked nothing in return and offered everything in its place. She exhaled. She straightened. She lifted her chin in the way she did when the part of her that refused to be cornered decided to make itself known. "Then we deal with Reyes," she said. Something moved in Victor's expression, not surprise, but its warmer, quieter relative. He nodded once. "Together," Mara added, with the specific, unambiguous weight of a woman establishing the terms of the board she has just agreed to play on. Victor looked at her for a moment longer. "Together," he said. Mara Vesci had come to the Bianchi estate to be nobody. She had kept that arrangement intact for exactly 732 days. On day 733, she had whispered 7 words in a dim corridor and set in motion everything that followed: the study, the library, the kitchen, the dress, the dinner, the letter falling into the dark. She was not a ghost anymore. She was not invisible, not unclaimed, not safely unremarkable. She was the woman standing in Victor Bianchi's study at dawn, with a rival's message drying on her corridor floor and a Don at her side who had just agreed, for the first time in his considerable and dangerous life, to face something together. The marble was cold. The message had been sent. And Mara, for the first time in 2 years, was not running from any of it. She was, at last, exactly where she had always been brave enough to want to be. The only question that remained was whether the world she had just stepped fully into would let her stay. Mara Vesci came to the Bianchi estate looking for nothing more than a quiet, unremarkable life that kept her fed, kept her safe, and asked as little of her inner world as possible. She found, instead, a marble-floored mansion full of secrets, a dangerous man who noticed her before she noticed him noticing, and the slow, irreversible discovery that a life built entirely around self-preservation is not the same thing as a life actually lived. She whispered 7 words. She meant every one of them. And the cost, the beautiful, terrifying, permanent cost, turned out to be exactly what she had always needed and never once allowed herself to ask for directly. Arrival's message is on the floor. Adon is at her side. And Mara Vesci, for the first time in 2 years, is standing fully in the open with her eyes forward and her chin lifted, facing the most dangerous chapter of her life with the quiet, unshakable composure of a woman who has finally stopped running from the thing she wants most. The marble is cold, but she is not afraid. If you have made it this far, thank you for staying. If this story moved something in you, if Mara's voice felt familiar in a way you were not expecting, then you already know exactly why she stayed. Some risks are not reckless. Some risks are simply overdue. Until the next story, stay sharp, stay curious, and never underestimate the woman standing quietly in the corner.